Welcome everybody to the Horse SA webinar. We have today with us our guest presenter, Mariette Vandenberg from New South Wales, actually, from MB Equine Services. Yes, nearly said Queensland. and
I was in Queensland.
and Mariette will today talk about feeding the modern horse. So over to you, Mariette.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you for organizing and hosting this webinar. And I also want to thank everybody that is joining tonight on the webinar. So my background is in animal science and particularly animal nutrition, and I did a specialization in equine nutrition. So in my bachelor, actually, I've done a little bit of work with wildlife and, of course, horses. And one of the projects I did some research on was calcium and phosphor balances in Shetland ponies. And then for my master, I actually moved to New Zealand to work with Massey University to look at dietary transition, how this affects the gut health of the horse. So really looking at the microbes in the gut of thoroughbred horses, and was from a pasture environment to concentrate feeding, and also in relation to acidosis and laminitis. So something that we're going to highlight also in this webinar. Currently, I am enrolled and working for the University of New England in Armidale, where I am undertaking a PhD that focuses on foraging behavior and diet selection in horses. And I'm particularly interested in orosensory feedback and post-ingestive feedback. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in this webinar. And I particularly are interested in this kind of foraging behavior and diet choices and preference in horses. So I kind of build a little bit this webinar around that. I also run a consulting business, MB Equine Services, and I will talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, so what are we going to talk about tonight? We have limited time, and also the idea is that we address only a couple of topics, and I'm particularly interested to kind of go into the behavioral side of feeding. So unfortunately, we won't be able to address all of the questions, so we asked you to fill in a survey, and also if there were any particular questions. I am taking a couple of those questions, and throughout the presentation I hope to answer those, but there will be probably lots that I can't cover in this webinar. So I invite you to provide feedback on which subject you would like to have like a short presentation on, like we do today. And as what Julie was saying, this is really a tryout. And so what in this presentation I would really like to highlight and provide tips on pretty much the promoting adaptive behavior, and with that digestive health, because those two are related. And to be able to get to those kind of management strategies, we need to kind of look first a little bit in a very brief kind of overview at current horse behavior in natural systems, so in free roaming and wild situations. And then we're going to look at how we are managing and feeding the modern horse, so pretty much horses that we keep in captivity, and what is happening with the horse when we are having kind of mismanagement, or if we are giving certain feedstuffs to horses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about horse well-being, and again there is a little bit more focus towards the behavioral side of things, but I will also talk a little bit about digestive and metabolic problems. So throughout the webinar you can ask questions, so there is this question box, and you already probably practiced with that. And then Julie will highlight a couple of questions, and we'll have little breaks where we could address them throughout the webinar. And at the end we'll probably pick a couple if there's still some questions at the end of this webinar. So it probably is very obvious, and it's maybe you have read already a lot about this, and it's probably highlighted in many workshops and in a lot of horse articles, and when you're dealing with health and veterinarian care. But it's very important that we go through this, especially when we're going to compare it with the way the modern horse is kept and how we feed the modern horse. So in the wild, the horse, or in a natural situation, a free-roaming situation, horses are adapted to eat almost on a continuous basis, a diet high in fiber. And they are adapted generally to what we see, a semi-arid region, and they travel significant distances to each day to obtain food and water. And if we now look at actually the time budget, I actually put up a graph in the corner. We see that horses feed, they lie, stand, and travel. But the main activity, as you can see, the big chunk, is foraging, which in the case of free-roaming horses is pretty much grazing and browsing. They are also highly social animals, and so they generally move in groups. And when we're really looking at the foraging part, or if we really look at the foraging behavior, it actually consists of two phases, what we call the appetitive phase and the consumptive phase. So the first phase is really about seeking of food sources, and the consumptive phase is really the process of ingesting the food item. And so we generally say that foraging consists of a number of components that allow the animal to adjust to forage availability and to meet its own nutritional requirements. So we'll talk a little bit about this so-called patch foraging behavior a little bit later on. But these aspects are pretty much the main ones that I want to highlight. There are probably a lot of other behavioral needs that we can address, but as I said, we have a bit of a main focus on foraging. So one of the main things that I've been very interested in, and is also a big part of my PhD, is to learn more. If I want to learn more about better feeding management and for horses in captivity, I needed to look first at, well, what is actually behavior in the wild, or in the feral horses or free-roaming horses. And here I have a nice kind of a summary of a table that I actually made to kind of look at the percentage of what kind of feedstuffs the horse is actually searching. So we first recognize that horses are evolved as primarily grazing herbivores. And so the estimated graze to browse ratio is 90 to 10% of their total diet. But in some cases we can actually categorize horses as what we call mixed feeders, which means that they graze less than 90% and then they browse more than 10%. And this depends on a variety of, there are a couple of factors that may influence this, and the biggest one is probably the season and food availability. And so what we see, and I have a couple of pictures on the bottom, those are actually from free-roaming horses or feral horses in central Australia. And as you can see, they are browsing there on shrubs, so kind of lower vegetation. But horses can browse on trees, water plants, forbs, and that is all categorized as browse, whether when we talk about grass or grass-like species, we're kind of talking about just your grass plants and generally some of your legumes like your clover and lucerne. So what we see is that, or what kind of researchers are highlighting, is that in a natural system, horses browse on or feed on a variety of foods to balance macronutrients, so carbohydrates, protein, fats, water, and also for minerals and vitamin requirements. So we're going to talk about why having a variety of, have multiple choices is very important, and how this can help with improving behavior in captivity.
Mariette, excuse me, we've just had some comments in from attendees that they've noticed their horses loaf around and do not very much, actually, when they're not eating. So have you got any comments on that?
And this is on, I assume, on pasture, in paddocks?
Yes.
And so this is in captivity, and so what I want to do is I want to leave that question for a couple of slides later when
Yes.
we're going to talk about some of the behavioral side of things. So when we're having horses in captivity and just having horses standing around and kind of looking also at a couple of other behaviors that we probably would like to change. We would like to see the horse more occupied with their natural behavior like this grazing and browsing. Just what I want to highlight before we go to the next slide is that As you can see here in this nice graph of in this table, there's quite a lot of research that had looked at feral horses, and I just want to highlight that it's throughout the world. So the US, there's actually most of the research actually or looked at free roaming horses has been from the US, but also in the UK or North America, UK. There are a couple of studies here in Australia and in Europe, and as you can see, there is a bit of variation, so not everybody found the same thing, and so it really depends on the geographical location and the availability. So for instance, very harsh environments are, for instance, southern New Mexico, where you can see that, and also western Alberta, and also in the Wyoming area, so in the US, we see that horses almost, even on an annual basis, can browse almost up to 50%. And this has also been seen primarily in winter in the UK. So it's quite interesting, and it's something that probably has been overlooked a lot in when we're actually looking at feeding behavior and how we could actually maybe utilize this to kind of increase that adaptive behavior. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just wanted to kind of show this kind of natural, well, kind of look at the free roaming situation. So let's now actually take that and actually look at where we are going now. Like, we have taken the horse from its natural environment, and they are now maintained in conditions very different from the free roaming situations. And as you can see here in these pictures, it really highlights quite well. There are a variety of things that have changed, but the main reason, or the main things that have changed for horses are, very obviously, the confinement and the use of the animal. First, we hunted the animal for meat, and it became then a working animal. And now, and that's also why we are interested in doing the best for our horses, is that we are using them for sporting and recreation, and they most of the time fulfill a role as a pet animal. So we really want to do the best for them. And so what we see is that with that, the third thing that really has changed, and that's also the focus of this webinar, is nutrition and feeding.
Mariette, excuse me, I've just had a question about if you could possibly turn up your own laptop voice or the sound a little bit higher, and just see if that can help some people.
I hope this is now better.
So hopefully the person that asked that question can respond now and just let us know if Mariette's a bit louder. Thank you. Just continue on.
I think my microphone was a bit further away from me. I hope this is
yes, coming
louder.
Through. Yes, we've got good response now.
Okay. So as I said in the last thing, that is one of the main reasons that why we are kind of doing this presentation is actually looking at the nutrition and feeding. That has significantly changed. So many domesticated horses are kept either in stable environments for half of the time. In Australia, most of horses, up to 80% of the 75 to 80% of the horses, have actually 24-hour access to pasture environments. But even in these situations, they are generally managed on smaller acreage, and so we still have to consider that as a intensive way of how we manage horses. So what we see is that one of the first things is that horses commonly receive infrequent cereal-based concentrates, and this may not always be something that is across board all horses, but I just want to generalize that, especially in the top end of performance or intensive management, we provide quite a lot of cereal-based concentrates. And what we also see is that horses don't always get the minimum requirement of forage. So, and the other thing, and that's probably where I'm probably going a little bit into more detail in, is that if there's also little, if any, variation in the forage ration, so the variety that we provide to horses. And even where horses have then access to pasture, we are encountering another problem, and this is probably where most sit here in Australia, and when they're dealing with pastures, is that they are generally kept on improved pastures and monocultures where they can be challenged with what we call pastures high in non-structural carbohydrates, and these are generally low in fiber and can put horses at risk. So also with just to compare with the free roaming or the free roaming horses, I just have here also a time budget diagram, and as you can see now, horses stand more, and this is probably relating to that question. We can now see that horses stand more and spend less on foraging, and yeah, it's pretty much the foraging part of around 60% has now been totally kind of replaced by standing, and we see generally only like a 50% foraging. Again, this graph is a bit generalized based on probably mainly horses that have stabling during the night, and then only a small amount of access during the day to either a paddock or even a grazing area.
Mariette, just might ask people that are attending to practice putting their hand up. They've got an electronic hand on most devices, and put that up if your horse is on improved pastures, so not on natural grasses or unimproved paddocks, but they're on improved paddocks, so sowed seed and fertilised. Okay, we've got probably 50% there, I think.
Yes, and also from the question, or pretty much from the response of the survey, I can see there were some questions about pasture problems and pasture species. So I assume that a lot of people that are attending tonight are dealing with either kind of monocultures or pasture species that are quite high and that can accumulate quite significant amounts of non-structural carbohydrates. So the way that we're feeding, either meal feeding, the way that we supply grains and less forage and improve pasture can all put horses at risk. And one of the things I want to kind of highlight is that we have to be aware that the behavioral patterns associated with our domesticated horses are built on the behaviors from the wild, or pretty much what they have been evolved to. And so we cannot simply wipe them out by our selective breeding. And we've done quite a lot of good things with breeding. We have so many beautiful breeds, but the digestive system of the horse has not changed. and also the kind of the herbivorous nature of the horse was also determined very early on, and so it really refined the system, the physiology and the behavior towards its diet. So we have to be very aware of that. And so what we see, and that probably brings us to the next slide, and pretty much why people are so interested in getting more information about nutrition and want to do the best for the horses, because we are dealing with our population of horses are dealing with a variety of disorders that have been linked to not only our feeding but also the way that we are managing. And in particular, I just want to highlight a couple of pretty much it's a couple of studies, but they showed that in stabled racehorse in particular in the UK and here in Australia, that restricting the quantity of forages and also actually variety is only a couple of studies that highlighted that provided to stabled horses has been correlated with kind of either digestive problems or stereotypical behaviors such as crib biting, windsucking, wood chewing, and weaving. So that is something that I want to go into next. But first I want to kind of ask the question, who is actually, well, actually we've done a survey, sorry, and it just showed that from the people that responded that number one is problem was, or the most specified problem was laminitis. which was followed by 2, obesity, and then number 3 was colic, followed by tying up, and then kind of a cluster of disorders kind of had a similar response was stereotypical behavior, acidosis, and ulcers. The number 1 killer in horses is considered colic, and number 2 laminitis. So that those 2 are at the top of, that you specified for this webinar is not surprising. So these are 2 disorders that a lot of people are either encountering firsthand or either have people that they in this direct surrounding that have been dealing with horses that have laminitis or colic or any of the other ones. So obesity is probably one of those that is also linked to laminitis. So in this webinar, I don't want to go into much more detail about the actual disorders. And as I said, I really want to kind of focus more on the behavioral side of things, because I really feel that laminitis and colic could be actually almost on its own a webinar. So one of the first things is, before we go to the next one, is stereotypical behavior. Not everybody is actually aware of what it actually is, and it can cause quite a lot of confusion. I have 2 videos that I'm going to show, but what I want to first say is that stereotypical behavior is a repetitive behavior that has no obvious function, and what we generally also refer to, actually the old school kind of reference was obsessive compulsory disorder or behavior. And so we also use it, we also say sometimes that it's redirective behavior. So when an animal is in conflict and can't get out of a situation, it will show a repetition of certain behaviors to either calm itself down, or it is kind of responding to stresses directly in the environment or from its own metabolic stresses. So we just I'm going to just go to the next slide. And I have here a video, and I will just show it, and I will, throughout when it's running, I will actually explain a little bit about what we see here. And it will probably be interesting afterwards to put your hand up if you are dealing with this kind of behavior.
Just before we watch the video, or we can replay that, we've just got a question here, Mariette. What does EMS stand for regarding obesity?
EMS is equine metabolic syndrome, and is generally related to obesity. And it has another factor is that it generally has is linked to insulin resistance, so it's kind of all clustered together. So EMS really kind of highlights that the horse is overweight, and that the horse is also has insulin resistance. So so that's kind of a metabolic disorder. And with that, it's also generally linked to or can be related with Cushing's syndrome as well. So it's a big cluster, and it's almost something that we have to explain in a separate session.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope I kind of answered that in
Yes.
what the term is.
Yes.
To actually what the disorder is all about is a whole new session. So I will just leave that for now, but definitely I would suggest, if you are interested in that, to kind of do a bit of a search on it, because there is a lot of information about that. But it's generally linked to obesity and insulin resistance in horses. So while I'm just going to play that video again, so because we just got a little bit off topic. So as you can see here, the horse is showing what we call the crib biting and the wind sucking behavior. And as you can see, the horse has actually been taking out chunks from the stable door as well. So we can maybe even say that there is maybe some evidence of wood chewing. So you can really hear this sound of the air getting sucked into the throat, and it actually is generally circulated. So it actually comes back out of the mouth. A part actually is ingested, but a lot of people think that it just goes straight to the stomach. It's actually more of a circulation in the cavity, and that makes that kind of sound when it passes the larynx. So and this behavior can continue, and as you can see, it's just repetitive, and I just would like to see some. Maybe Julie can let me know how many hands are actually up for being aware of this or experiencing this behavior with their horses.
Okay, so if anyone has had their horse windsuck, can you just put your electronic hand up? Or maybe you've had a horse in the past that has windsucked. We've got no hands up, but we do have a question. The question is, does Cushing's disease normally affect only older horses?
That's a very interesting question, and the answer is probably yes in most cases. However, what we see now actually in some trends is actually that the age is actually dropping to almost to the around 10, between 10 and 15 we see more cases of Cushing's. It's also because probably we are more aware of it, and there are other factors that may play a role, like these horses may already experience, for instance, obesity or insulin resistance. So they are tested earlier on, and then they also find out they may even have Cushing. So we do see that the age is actually dropping, and I think that is just early monitoring, but it could also be actually a reflection of the way that we are managing the horse. So yes, older horses, but it doesn't mean that we cannot see it in say 10 horses that are a bit younger. So it's good to hear, or to hear that there are no hands up, because crib biting and wind sucking can actually be a very difficult one to treat, and what we see is that a lot of people will use devices around for the neck to kind of stop it, and or put kind of material on the actual wood to make it less palatable to actually bite into it. But there's some, most of this behavior we can actually reduce by the way that we're feeding. In some cases, it is so ingrained because it can actually be a hedonic effect. So where horses actually do it because it feels good, that it stays with them for the rest of their life, and it's a very hard one to get rid of. But with proper feeding, or when we're actually looking more of the behavior and looking at foraging in general, most cases we can actually reduce that. So we'll discuss that when we get to the tips. So that is actually one of the stereotypical behaviors, what we call oral, that are oral stereotypical behaviors. The other one, there are actually two classes. The second one is locomotive behavior. And I just want to show this video as well, and there are a couple of things that we can talk about in this video as well. So this is an adjustment situation, a very common situation where horse owners want to have the horse stabled or paddocked individually to reduce harm to the horse. But as you can see, this horse, and I stopped the video there because this continues for quite a long time, where the horse is pacing, walking the boundary fence, and as you can see, there are no other horses there. First of all, it is really kind of stressed probably about the fact that it's separated and can't see other horses. And this locomotive behavior is something that we observe as well. So there are various kinds of behaviors that we can classify as either stereotypical. However, I do have to highlight that you may see this behavior in stallions, like only during certain periods with breeding. So you have to be very aware when you observe this behavior, how you classify it. But in this case, it's very obvious that the horse is in a conflict. It cannot get to a certain area, and is doing this for a long time, like it has no obvious function. And the biggest thing I want to highlight is that this horse spends all this time on this behavior and is taken away from actually foraging. And as you saw in the first slide, horses spend up to 17 hours a day foraging, grazing or browsing. And so, yeah, it's very important that the horse gets its time on that, that it gets its food and that it spends time on chewing, because that has all kinds of benefits for the digestive system. As you can see, there are a couple of things that we're not going into in this seminar, but there are a couple of design things that you can look at when it comes to behavior. So it's not only nutrition that we can change, but as you can see, we can also change actually the layout of our property to actually create a better environment where horses could be social, can be social, and we can, reduce any of these behaviors.
Sorry, Mariette, we've just got some questions coming in, which is really good. First of all, if we don't get to your question during the webinar, Mariette will have a copy of them and she'll be able to answer the unanswered ones afterwards. But I'll just bring forward one question. So again, it's just recapping the stereotypic behaviours and the use of that terminology versus the use of the word vices. If you just probably recap on that.
Yeah, I think if I'm correct, it's a kind of an old term that has been used in kind of management books. I think of a North European origin, and so the more modern term now, as I said, is what we call stereotypical behavior. The other one is abnormal behavior. Sometimes it's still used as obsessive compulsory disorders, but you don't see that as much anymore. So yeah, so just be aware that we're talking about the same, only yeah, the stereotypic behavior is better defined because of the repetitive, no function definition. So there are a couple of things, there are a lot of things that we can talk about, like the way that the shelters are set up and all kinds of design things, but I just want to kind of continue on the nutritional side of things. So what can we actually do to improve? So how can we kind of reduce these behaviors, and how can we promote for better digestive health? So first of all, we need to consider the digestive anatomy and physiology of the horse, so we have a better understanding of how we can actually maintain better gut health. And in this presentation, we're not going to go into that, but in the workshops I generally go into all that material, so we kind of go through a journey and then end up with pastoral management. But for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to focus more on the dietary path. And the second one, which is very obvious when I kind of showed the stereotypical behaviors in the videos, is that we also need to understand these behavioral needs. And I only really briefly touched on that, showing the natural behavior of free-roaming horses and wild horses. But it's the key for us to understand that, we need to understand that, and that will be the key for us to kind of promote adaptive behavior and kind of have better welfare. And that's probably also not only where nutrition sits, but that's also where good property, like looking at your property design and the way you set up your paddocks and your stables to facilitate for that social aspect for foraging behavior and all those things. So the third thing that we can do is look at our dietary management and pasture management to avoid any of those disorders that we highlighted and behavioral, not only diet but also behavioral problems.
Okay, Mariette, just got another question. Just asking about fence walking again, just before we move on to the next sort of topic. Is that a stress behaviour in stallions, or is that just related to the breeding season and they won't do it outside the breeding season? A little comment on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, you really have to put it, you have to really look into kind of the situation of how the stallion is kept. We generally see that this may occur during breeding, and if it's just a short part of the day or only for a particular period, we may not consider it stereotypic right away, but it can, as I said, it can take time away of the horse actually foraging. And as I said, horses are designed to eat on almost a continuous basis, and so stallions could be at risk to develop colic if they, if they do this for a significant part of the day, even if that's only for like 4 weeks or 3 weeks. So I still would try to adapt the management so that you can reduce any of this fence walking. Also, in relation to, for instance, your pasture and your soil health, because you will probably get a track at the end of the breeding season. So, yeah, I will be careful. I will not directly categorize it as stereotypic, but you probably still would like to reduce it for a variety of those reasons. So, I always been very careful with when we're classifying stereotypic behavior, especially locomotive behavior. It has to be a significant part, and it needs to be repetitive, and it's almost kind of a system that the horse has. It will always show this behavior at certain, at certain times or during certain pressures, pretty much. So, and that's probably where it's very hard to be very precise with it. So, but I just want to highlight that any behavior that we see, we really would like to reduce that because of the horse not being able to spend more time on foraging. So I hope this was just setting the frame of what kind of disorders we are encountering, and I don't want to focus too much on it because there's so much probably to talk about individually about any of those disorders. But what I really want to focus on, and that's probably where we're starting now, is talking about the foraging aspects. So I already highlighted that horses forage. They have 2 phases where they actually search for food, and then they actually have a moment where they ingest the food. And this is what we kind of call the so-called patch foraging behavior. So they take a few bites of plants before walking a few steps to a new feeding station. And animals do this, or herbivores do this. It's not only horses, but all herbivores do this to be able to select a better than average diet from a diverse source. And this patch foraging behavior and the selection of a variety of foods is important. Is an important adaptive strategy in herbivores. And this is probably where it kind of links to tips, giving tips on how we can facilitate for that. So the researchers done research on kind of mechanisms that influence diet selection and food intake, and so the biological basis of selecting a varied diet in herbivores has been largely explained by just sampling forages and plants to ingest the necessary nutrients and to reduce the potential of actually over-ingesting certain compounds, secondary compounds or toxins in plants. And just want to highlight that all plants have secondary compounds, but they vary in the degree and also the type that they actually accumulate. So, for instance, we have in grasses you can find alkaloids. In for instance, in legumes you can find saponins. So, for instance, lucerne has saponins, and so horses and cattle are limited to how much they can take. So that's where we see this this behavior where they have to select a variety of things. And just want to highlight here those pictures actually where we see this behavior where there is still grass on one side, but horses and cattle would like to just eat the other, like the part of the on the other side of the fence. The grass is always greener at the other side of the fence, and there are probably a couple of reasons for that. So one is for nutrients. The second one is for reducing the over-ingestion of secondary compounds. And then the third one that maybe, that you are aware of yourself is that you don't want to eat every day the same thing. And so what we see is that herbivores will also eat a variety of foods and forages, even if they had a nutritional complete diet. So, and that only varied in flavor. So flavor is another one that will kind of change food intake. So this kind of this suggests pretty much that the decisions that animals make and the motivations to eat a variety of foods may not always be the nutritional content, but can just be something like a flavor. And that's probably what you can see here, is that they just getting to a certain area and they do all this effort, like they even go through barbed wire and electric fences to get to it. So something must really motivate them to do it, because at the other side of the fence there's still enough to eat. So that's why we say that food intake and preferences, they all result from a interrelationship between the food's flavor, which is the odor and the smell, and the taste and the texture, and the effect that the food has on the organ, so the post-ingestive feedback. And flavors, nutrients, and toxins can all bring what we call, as you can see here in the diagrams, satiety, so the satiety theory. So they can all bring on satiation for a food, and they can actually change the preference while we're eating the food. So we see it in ourselves, but also in herbivores, either during or after eating that food. And so that kind of shows that animals can change their preferences at any time. So they will eat certain food and then change, and that's also why we see this patch foraging behavior. So animals move through the landscape and actually eat patches of forages and then move on to the next thing for any of those reasons. So either primary compounds, flavor, or secondary compounds. And that may be something that you may have not even thought about, but it's a very interesting aspect, and that's also where my research kind of goes into, to look more into detail about, well, how does that work in horses? Because most of the research that has been looking into any of these aspects have been in ruminants, so cattle, sheep, and goats, and in rats, but actually not a lot of research has been done in the ability of horses to kind of recognize foods based on nutrients and toxins and flavors. So that's probably where my research sits in.
We've just got some more questions coming in, Mariette. So we've got one that you may have answered already in some way. It's got, is it true that horses or animals can be naturally aware of deficiencies in their diet and will eat uncommon foods, for example, bark?
Yes, very interesting question, and that's probably where where those pictures can highlight that this kind of touches on self-medication. So animals will eat even what we call maybe natural things, like, for instance, dirt, bark, or even they would eat certain weeds that have certain even hedonic effects. So even like horses can get high. Like there's a plant, for instance, in North America called loco weed. So loco means, is the Spanish word for crazy. And animals will eat that, cattle and horses will eat it, and it has a direct feedback on like nutrients. So it's very palatable and it's high in protein, but it has a very dangerous toxin that builds in the body, and horses can well actually die of it. So but it's a big delay, and so the animal will continuously eat it because it has also kind of a effect on their kind of getting high. So it's one of those things that we see. And also bark, eating bark, we don't know the real reason behind it. Generally we assume that it's again for finding nutrients, so either fiber, energy, or minerals, but none of the studies that I actually looked at has been able to quantify that. So they were not able to they tested the bark for those minerals and nutrients, and the only one that kind of came out of it was apparently fiber. So fiber seemed to be the motivator to kind of chew bark. And a lot of people have been telling me that that generally happens when there is not a lot of pasture availability. So we see it maybe in seasons again, like during the winter, horses may browse. But that's not always. We can see horses throughout the year. So again, there's no set rule like that only will happen in these situations. And so I've come to the conclusion probably that just for the variety of any of those three that are highlighted here, so nutrients, flavor, or secondary compounds, horses may select bark. And in the same way, they probably will select dirt for those reasons, either to reduce toxins, or to get minerals, or just for the flavor. It's very hard because we can't ask the horse, and so that's why we kind of show the, that's why we kind of work in this quadrant. So we're showing this, these kind of potential factors that may influence this behavior. And that's a really good question, actually. And so what I want to do now is actually kind of progress. That is kind of just a very short overview of kind of my interest in research and a very interesting behavior. And probably you can do a whole seminar on how animals actually, there's a lot of research, as I said, with ruminants that I can show of how they change diets just based on flavor and just based on toxins and based on nutrients. There is a little bit of information out there, but nothing is known in horses. So what I kind of going to show now is just part that probably has been studied, and there's a part that has not been studied. And so, but if it works in herbivores, we can adapt it to probably other herbivores. So that will be the next slide. But first, talk about what we can actually do to support adaptive behavior. And of course, feeding more roughage is one of those things, and probably everybody is aware, like more fiber in the horse for digestive health. And the other thing is probably what you may be aware of is increasing feeding times. But because we are busy people and we are generally working, we either have the morning or the afternoon, and so we may have to look into strategies like slow feeding. And you may have heard of it, or you may already adapt it yourself, but it can help. And I have here a picture in the top where you can see a slow feeding, so-called slow feeding hay net, which has the smaller openings, which is the green one, and then you have the normal hay net, the normal standard hay net, which has the bigger openings. And so by slow feeding, the idea behind it is that because the opening is smaller, the animals have to take smaller bites and take more often bites, so which means that this would increase the actual time spending on foraging compared if they would have those bigger openings. It means they can take bigger bites and kind of do that much rapidly. So big chew movements rather than smaller bites and chewing more consistent. The other thing is that what we look at is looking at roughage types. So I'm not going into much detail about which types are really good for horses and which one are not good. But what we know is that if we provide longer stem or longer cut, it will slow down eating because the horse actually has to spend more on chewing. And this will also allow for more saliva production and dental health, and this will also aid the digestion. It's kind of interesting that here in Australia it's very popular to have very fine chopped chaff, and when I asked during my trial to get a forage company to actually make me a long cut, this company was very interested in making one, but he said I have not been able to sell it at all. So people want to have the short chop. But longer chop would actually be much better because horses will need to chew much more. And also the other thing that's probably very popular is lucerne hay. But lucerne hay has less stem, and so it will be easier for the horse and quicker for the horse to eat. So I generally advise to kind of look into a variety of forages, one with long stem, and still provide lucerne, especially when you're dealing when you're dealing with either there's a shortage of hay, so there is no other option than lucerne, or if you are dealing, for instance, with laminitic or laminitic horses, where you want to kind of be a bit careful with getting grassy hay from those improved pastures. And the other thing that I would not go into much more detail is actually reviewing your supplementary feeding. So in most cases of kind of when we look at the recreational horse, they really don't need any additional grain diet of like a grain, a cereal grain in their diet, and definitely review your quantities. But if you are exercising and you really need that kind of fast energy, a grain is very good. So it's not that we're against grains, it's just the purpose and the amounts that we're feeding. So it may be actually a better option to kind of look at what we so-called low GI, so low glycemic index products. And some of those you may be aware of is like the soybean hull, the sunflower hulls. We have grape pulp and your copra meals. They have been promoted as one of those low GI feeds, and also commercial companies step into that market. In cases where you are dealing with maybe a bit of kind of low pasture availability, you do have to maybe supplement with like a protein source, and oil will probably be a nice replacement for your if you're if you want to have more energy but you don't want to feed too much grain. And then supplements, again, this depends on your situation, either with pasture and but what I want to highlight is that if horses get fresh forages, they get most of their vitamins from fresh forages, or they can synthesize it themselves, so either through their microbes in the hindgut or through their liver, so vitamin B complex, and it can be kind of synthesized by bacteria in the hindgut, and vitamin C can actually be synthesized in the liver. So only when we're dealing with sick horses and extreme cases of competing, you may want to kind of top on vitamins, but it's probably the one that you may want to have to look into is your minerals, depending if you're dealing with what we call tropical or high oxalate pastures. So again, I don't want to go in too much detail into the products, because I think that there's quite a lot, there's probably a whole seminar on which types, and I think that would be probably a nice invitation if we would like to know more about like nutrient requirements of horses and nutrient resources and nutrient digestion. I think that could be a whole seminar on its own.
Sorry, Mariette, we've just got another question here. Is there a downside to the slow feeder hay nets because of the abnormal or greater use of the incisors?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and what has been very popular is also a lot of people make their own slow feeding, not necessarily a hay net, but you can make like a slow feeding station, so it's either a box or a container and you put a grid over it. And I have, some people have observed that if it's like a grid, like a metal grid, it can actually potentially damage the teeth of the horse. So with these hay nets, because it's soft, it will have less impact actually on the teeth of the horse. So far, to my knowledge, I have actually not seen any work or research or any observation from people where they really see that the slow feeding hay nets is affecting the shape. And probably this is where we kind of have to look into long term of the use of these hay nets. But it's definitely a much better solution than feeding everything at once and then letting the horse just stand around. That will put your horse at risk for colic, and I think the wear and tear on the teeth will be less with a slow feeding hay net, like a soft one like those, and will be much better than putting your horse at risk of colic. So definitely would go for a slow feeding hay net, but definitely observe so that you are aware of what kind of impact it may have. And when we're dealing with old horses, this may not be a good solution either, because they don't have, they sometimes miss teeth. It's probably more important to give them more of a kind of mesh, and that's where, for instance, your low GI products like a soybean hull and copra can actually be used. So yeah, just depending on the age of the horse, the hay net may not really be a good idea, and they probably need the bigger one or more readily available more chopped one. So yeah, so again, there's a purpose for anything, and probably pros and cons with everything. But if I'm correct, there is now, and I just and there is a link about some recent research that came out this year, actually this month, about the use of slow feeding hay nets, and it has shown that it reduces it increases the feed intake, and it actually reduces it increases the time spent on foraging, and also enhance the feed intake. So and I think there is a link, if I'm correct, Julie, that you
Yes, I can send one out afterwards.
That can be sent afterwards, which was work from, I think, the University of Minnesota, and they actually published that. So it's actually in a journal. So which is really good, because we've been talking about this, but I think there's only been very limited work done on actually this slow feeding hay nets. But again, this is only one study, and it's not a magic bullet. Just by only supplying slow feeding hay nets, it doesn't mean that that we're protecting the that we don't see any of the behavioral disorders, or that we have now a happy horse. So it's just one of those things that you can add to your your feeding management. And so let's go actually to the next tip that that actually probably fits much more with what is pretty much fits a little bit more with my research, and what I'm really interested in is this variety theory, that giving horses or giving animals more choice will also increase the time spending with their food. And so we have actually a really interesting question that relates to that. Somebody was asking about, do horses actually regulate feed intake? And I probably want to kind of discuss that in this slide, because we're talking about free choice here, and I put in brackets there minerals, because research that has actually been looking at AppLib kind of either concentrates or like food items and foodstuffs showed that one of the researchers that gave ponies AppLib concentrates, the ponies actually just ate themselves to obesity. So it seems somehow that, and later research of this researcher looked into these control mechanisms, and it seems that horses actually have a very weak regulation of intake, and that is probably due to their digestive system, because their hindgut fermenters, they don't get direct feedback as we see, for instance, in ruminants, because ruminants have first fermentation before digestion. They have this rumen that is kind of a measuring device and provides direct feedback to the animal about nutrients and toxins, whether horses have first enzymatic digestion, and then they have this big fermentation fat, their hindgut. And so what we see is it's a longer gut transition time, and so the assumption is from researchers is that that horses don't have that instant feedback, and so that may explain why horses overeat very easily. And so it seems that horses are more use visual cues and smell and taste to kind of make decisions of to stop either feeding or to start feeding or to change. So so what we call the olfaction and gustation seems to be much more important in diet selection compared to ruminants. And that's where sometimes AppLib feeding is not really a good strategy because of because of this system. But there's not a lot of research that actually continued in this, and so my focus with my PhD is actually looking in this importance of smell and taste, because nobody actually done any trials with horses. And if you look at the picture on the top, you see actually a small pilot I've done with this pony, and you can see their soybean hulls, and I added different flavors to kind of look first just at preferences, but I'm going to use those flavors to look at actually if horses can determine and discriminate between foods and the nutritional content. But free choice, actually providing horses multiple choice, can be very handy when we're dealing with minerals. So it's something to be probably not a good idea when we're dealing with concentrate, but when it comes to minerals, we can actually provide them, as you can see in the picture below the horse, this kind of feeding station with kind of what we call macro minerals, so calcium and phosphor separately. And so the animal can actually visit it and what we call self-medicate. So whenever it it needs, for instance, more calcium, it can actually access it, or at the same time, if it needs more phosphorus or magnesium or sulfur, it can actually visit it on its own terms. And as you can see, this is actually a system that they've made for cattle, and so this is what we call cafetaria, free choice, mineral, and these are loose licks, and probably as horse owners we are more familiar with your lick blocks, but unfortunately they are generally formulated, and so when the horse will lick, it will kind of take bites or licks from it, it will try to get a certain mineral, either salt or calcium, but it may not need the other one. So having kind of free choice will allow the animal to kind of self-medicate and only select that what is needed on that day, because every day changes, especially if horses are in a pasture environment. They are dealing with daily changes within the plant and variety of species, and especially between seasons. Horses may need more calcium when there's more oxalate pastures, or if they are moving to more of a legume paddock with more native grasses, they may not need that much calcium, so you can really adapt that. But that requires a little bit of training, because we can get horses that just somehow eat all the salt or eat all the calcium. But yeah, this system can be used, so I just want to kind of highlight that. But again, not a lot of, actually there's no research, so to my knowledge, it has done any trials on it. So it's just something that that we kind of do with cattle, and it would be interesting to do to kind of adapt that to horses. But we're already doing it with lick box. It's just only the loose licks is something that I would be interested to see if, and also to get feedback from horse owners. So I just want to put it out there. And then the other thing is with the flavors, if you are dealing, for instance, with concentrates, or for instance with these low GI foods, like this can sometimes be very unpalatable, and so adding flavor will help with feed intake. But also if we are changing animals to different environments, keeping their favorite flavor will really help with that. They're not getting off their feet, so for instance with competitions and things like that. And changing flavors will also help with that. For instance, the soybean hull is one of those that can be very difficult to feed to laminitic or obese ponies or horses, because it's not very palatable. And so when you add a flavor, it will eat it, but then after a while it gets satiated on the flavor. Then you, without changing the actual content, you actually just only can just change the flavor in a safe way without adding, any what we call calories. And this can be a very good strategy if you're dealing, for instance, with very limited nutritional, like options for your horse. And you can use non-nutritive flavors that are commercially available, like just from the human food industry. And you can use either herbal teas, or you can actually add herbs in it to kind of provide that aromatic change. So something just to, as a practical tip, to kind of create variety. So are there any questions on
No, we'll probably just go right through to the end now, Mariette, so that we can keep on time, and then we'll see if there's any questions at the end.
At the end, yeah. So pretty much this is the last, and I don't have a lot of kind of material on this, but enrichment foods has been probably something that has been studied most in zoo environments. As you can see, I have more pictures of zoo animals than of horses. But you may be familiar of like these cylinders or bowls where you can put foods in, and it kind of the horse can roll it around, and small amounts of food can come out. This is what we call so-called enrichment foods, and it can be a useful tool, especially when we're dealing with horses in stable environments, to keep them occupied. And this is in addition to, for instance, already providing hay nets, so it's not, on its own a solution, but it's just anything of what I kind of show in this presentation is just adding to creating strategies to either create variety or increase the time the animal is actually spending on foraging, and occupy the horse, so that it's, it's less likely to show any of the underside behaviors and or develop digestive disorders. So these kind of cylinders and bowls are commercially available. And as you can see with the zoo animals, it's really about creativity. Like zookeepers just come up with different ideas to present the same type of food or even different foods in different ways, and that's probably where I kind of invite you to kind of look at that and see if there's something that you can create for your own horses. One of the things that I've been using, and that probably relates back to my interest in this natural foraging behavior, is actually using browse. So doing cut and carry system with certain edible trees and shrubs and placing them in PVC tubes and actually attaching them like this, these horse ball, like these kind of balls and water bottles to the stable or to the paddock, and which allow the horse to browse on these branches, and this keeps them occupied and gives them something different. And it also they need to actually elevate their head, and it's a different technique, it's a different texture, and this will keep them quite occupied. And they generally relish it once they get used to the new food. They really start relishing it. And if you then mix it up, and it probably will also depend on what you have available and also within the season, because you may are dealing with some deciduous trees, you can kind of mix it up. So the browse is definitely a nice tip to look into. And I have here also, when we come to kind of just wrapping it up in a summary, you may have already given some foods like oranges, or you may have tried giving a banana to a horse. Watermelon is one of those, like a big watermelon can also be quite interesting to give to a horse. So it's really about some of the feed types that you can, some of different food types that are safe that you can introduce to your horse, but it may take a while to get them used to it. So don't reject it right away. Just give them some time. It takes at least 3 days or more, or even a week, before horses sometimes accept new food, so forages or feedstuffs. So just give the horse some time to get adjusted to it. So just in summary, I think it's now very aware that that horses spend quite a lot of time on foraging, and that the best thing that we can do for the horse is really have management strategies that really facilitate for that. And so either these dietary management strategies that I showed, these tips that I showed, with either forage variety, frequency, and different types of forages, and also pasture management is something that unfortunately I don't go into in this webinar, but definitely looking into more pasture access and variety will also help. And any of those enrichment foods can be very useful, and probably most useful in stable environments, or if you are managing your horse in very small kind of paddocks. That could also be a good one. And it will also allow, which I probably didn't highlight, for social facilitation. As you could see, those zebras that we're all gathering around, it may only take one animal to start using or start sampling the novel object or the novel food, but all the horses will kind of learn. So you'll get this social, as we call, social facilitation, and that would actually create that social aspect as well as foraging aspect, and that seemed to be a very good strategy to reduce any of those stereotypical behaviors. And there's a lot of probably research that you can do on feed products, and I just highlighted a couple of strategies. This webinar really kind of originate from the idea to provide tips for the care of the confined horse, and there is actually a fact sheet on this, and you can find it on the Horse SA website, and I think that Julie will provide you with some feedback and some links to the website, because there are a couple of other links that may be useful. And I just want to thank everybody for just attending this webinar. It's all very new, so any suggestions would be welcome, because I think a lot of people were interested in grass species, and it made me almost feel bad that I didn't have a lot in there. But as I said, it's almost a webinar on its own. I really wanted to kind of show more the behavioral side of things, and as I said, it linked a little bit into what kind of research is out there and what kind of research we are currently working on. And as I said, I run a consultancy business that focuses on nutrition, but also on property and pasture management. And we've run workshops in Adelaide before and throughout Australia on particular property and pasture management, because it's all integrated, and we use a number of kind of philosophies and strategies that I highlighted here. So I integrate the nutritional part in management, in pasture management and property designing. And as I said, I'm involved with research, and there are a lot of educational articles that you can also find on my website on any of those subjects, on nutrition and pasture and property. So definitely want to invite you to visit the website just for some free information, and also to join in on the Facebook page, because you will get updates on any research or workshops, and also releases of any of the articles.
Okay, we've just got a couple of questions to finish off with. The first one is, what types of trees basically are good to have in paddocks, because some trees might be toxic?
Yeah, so trees and shrubs. Yeah, so this is probably where the least information is. There is actually a guide, or there are many guides if you actually would Google weeds and toxic plants for horses. There are a couple of publications that will explain either on, there's one here in Australia, and you will find many in northern, in Europe and in America, that focus on the toxicity and on weeds and toxic plants. But there's not a lot actually. There's no book that really provides a bit of information. Well, which shrubs and trees and forbs can actually be fed to horses that are safe and could be like an alternative fodder source. And the ones that I only have been working with and can probably only advise would be a couple of Australian natives. So you have Kurrajong, and some horses really relish saltbush. There is some imported species, so it says Tagasaste, or also known as lucerne tree. There's also a tropical one called drumstick tree, or moringa tree. And so there are a couple, sometimes trees have multiple names. So there are a variety of names for some of the plants. I have been working with saltbush and also with lucerne tree, and the other one is bamboo and willow. So willow is, of course, a European tree, or a tree that is a deciduous tree, sorry, and so you will only find them in certain regions, and only certain times you can use it. So those are the ones that I've been using. But there are a couple of other natives, that lily pillies and fig trees, and there are a variety of trees that horses have been browsing on, like banana leaves. And there's quite a list when I did a survey and actually asked people about which trees, or if horses are actually browsing any trees in paddock environments. People gave me a whole list of trees, but there's no kind of booklet or kind of a fact sheet yet that can be advised, because there's not a lot tested, so, and also fed to horses. So if you go to my website, there is actually an article in the pasture section called Fodder Trees for Horses. So I would refer you to that, and that explains kind of the limitations and which species have been kind of linked to feeding to horses.
Okay, and just one more question. There are several here, but as we said earlier, perhaps type in your questions now just before we finish, and we'll email those to Mariette and she can answer them afterwards. One more question is just to talk perhaps a little bit more about enrichment foods, like if you're putting the feed inside the different toys, what kind of things would go in there?
Yeah, that's well, and this is probably where I would also kind of suggest to be very creative. Of course, just your pellets, you know, like pellets, especially in those cylinders and bowls, you can kind of just put like pelleted feed, like this kind of commercial feeds. Within those kind of bowls, or if you would cut out like a drum or a thing like that, you could put more like a chaff, or like if your horse can have it, like you can put like carrots, you know, like make it hard to get like in the bowl. You can maybe put small pieces of carrot, but again, it's like you know, kind of an additional food. So yeah, you have some limitations to what you can use. I know some people putting like some fruits in there, but again, not every horse, or you know, like they can be quite sugary. So yeah, have to be careful that you may kind of feed your horse like all candy. So I kind of would think more about like forage. You can, for instance, do hay cubes. It's something different. They are a different presentation of a forage. So you have like your loosened hay cubes. Those could be interesting to put like in a kind of in a either toy or like a system. And those soybean pellets and things like that can be useful, but you may have to add like a flavor to make it palatable. So yeah, I really would like to yeah, kind of leave that up to people to kind of find out what their horse likes, but you don't want to make it yeah, too much like too much sugary or things like that, because maybe that causes frustration. Horses will start pawing and really want to get to the honey pot. So you want to kind of sit in the middle, that it's palatable, but it's not making them really hyper to get to, you know, to really want to break it open and just, you know, just eat it in one go. Yeah, so carrots. Some people use apples, but yeah, that can be also high in sugar. Can be actually quite expensive. So I would kind of stick much more to your kind of your forages and some of these low GI feeds that come in pallets.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll finish the webinar there. So thank you very much, Mariette, and thank you very much for the different people that have joined in today, because it's our first official one for Horse SA, and hopefully we'll be able to hold some more in the future. As I mentioned before, people that have got comments or questions for Mariette that were not answered during the webinar, they'll be forwarded on and Mariette can answer those. And following the webinar, I'll be sending out an email which will have there some links that were talked about, and also the information that's appearing on your slide now with hot links. So again, thank you very much, and thank you, Mariette. And I'll just close down the webinar now. Thank you.